Order. Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee. We're very pleased to have in our panel today the Secretary of State for Scotland, the Minister, sorry I've forgotten your title already, Minister.
Parliamentary Under
Secretary of State at the Scotland Office and the Interim Director. So can I just ask all three of you please to briefly introduce yourselves. Thank you. I'll start with Anna.
Good morning, Chair. I'm Anna McMillan. I am the Interim Director at the Scotland Office. I've been holding this post for about 2 months. My substantive role is the Deputy Director of Communications at the Office. Thank you.
Ian Murray, Member of Parliament for Edinburgh South and Secretary of State for Scotland.
And I'm Kirsty McNeill. I'm the Member of Parliament for Midlothian and the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Scotland.
Until I'll never forget again. Good morning. We do thank you for coming back again, Secretary of State. The last session was slightly curtailed by other events in Parliament, so hopefully we won't have those problems today. We'll push on with our questions. So could I ask you to what extent the funding announced for Scotland at the spending review reflects an adequate settlement?
Well, good morning, Madam Chair. It's nice to see the committee again, and a warm welcome to Mr Dugan. I think this might be his first committee appearance while we've been here, so welcome to him. The spending review was a great success for Scotland, and I think it was a great success for the whole of the United Kingdom, and the Scotland Office worked very hard, not just on our own departmental settlement. I think it's really important to set out that there's two bits as far as we're concerned as a department in terms of the spending review. There's the departmental spending review, which is funding the Scotland Office and what we do, and then there's the wider spending review on its impact in Scotland, and we're working very hard on both, of course. The second part is probably the most important because that's the bit that delivers the record block grant, £9.1 billion extra over the spending review period. It's a multi-year spending review, which is what everyone has been demanding and asking for. So it gives the highest block grant in the history of the Scottish Parliament. But on top of all of that, there was huge amounts of spending in reserved areas, whether it be defence, in energy, and other areas. And the big ticket items, if you like, in terms of infrastructure in Scotland was the UK supercomputer, which will be based at the University of Edinburgh, the Acorn Carbon Capture and Storage Project, £200 million, linking, of course, St Fergus to Grangemouth. There was the full capitalisation of GB Energy, because there had been some naughty speculation perhaps of that would not be capitalised to its full 8.3 billion, but it has been, and that's confirmed in the spending review. The AI growth zones, the investment zones, the green free ports, the local growth funding, all in the spending review. So a really, really good spending review for Scotland. And from a Scotland Office perspective, we're incredibly pleased with it, particularly that ending of austerity that we promised in our manifesto, and that additional funding that's going to the Scottish Government in terms of that £9.1 billion extra.
Thank you. Very comprehensive answer. Can I ask you then, was there anything in your bid to the spending review that wasn't agreed to?
I don't think so, because the challenge for us as a Scotland Office is to make sure that other departments have in their spending reviews what we want in Scotland. So, for example, just for the benefit of the committee, the £750 million for the supercomputer at University of Edinburgh that Minister McNeill launched on the day of the spending review. That was in the departmental spending review. Acorn was obviously in DESNES's departmental spending review. So the Chief Secretary of the Treasury worked very hard cross-government, rather than the silo way that it's been done previously, to make sure that the Scotland Office in Scotland was well represented across the whole of the spending review in a sort of horizontal way, if I can use that sort of accounting term, rather than being in a siloed way. And the Cabinet Office had round tables, and they had bringing the territorial offices together with the other departments that were reserved to see what they were spending and what was in their spending review. So the simple answer to your question is no. We're very pleased with what we got. We're very pleased with what we asked for, and those were the targets and those were the priorities that we had.
Are you content that that way of working, the opportunity to input to other departmental discussions, as the Secretary of State, is the way that things will be matters will be conducted going forward?
Yeah, I mean, a spending review process isn't perfect, because it is very much about the departmental budgets being set. The envelope was set, of course, at the budget in October last year. So our role, really, from a very technocratic way, would be each individual department looks after their own budget, because they've got their own programmes that they want to fund. But it was really important to see that umbrella view across the whole of government in terms of what was coming to Scotland and what was benefiting Scotland. So we're incredibly pleased with it. And on top of all of that, the process can still get better, because obviously each individual department is looking after their own budget and their own priorities. But the 5 missions that were set out at the election were the drivers behind how to deliver the spending review, and of course they have to be done cross-departmental. There's a great acknowledgement in Whitehall and in government that the Scotland office is hugely important in terms of that delivery, whether it be in defence, the supercomputer, the green energy, and the growth agenda. The industrial strategy, of course, was launched this week. All of that together came part of the spending review. So yes, of course, there's always improvements that can be made. We always want more money, of course we do. We did get our £3 million over the course of this year and the spending review for Brand Scotland, which is our big frontline project. But in terms of the overall process, we were very pleased with it. I'm very pleased with the way in which the Treasury conducted that cross-departmental look for Scotland.
Thank you. The Fraser of Allender Institute has suggested that funding for Scotland will actually be 0.7% billion lower by 2028-29 compared to the Scottish Fiscal Commission's central estimate. Is that an interpretation that you are comfortable with or agree with?
Well, I don't recognise that, because this is comparing estimates rather than actuals. And if we look at the actuals of it, the £4.9 billion, which is £1.5 billion in the previous financial year part year, £3.4 billion extra in this financial year, £9.1 billion extra across the spending review period, which is the next 3 years, that's a 2.7% increase in real terms. So the report that the Fraser of Allender Institute did produce said that, but it also said that the £9.1 billion was technically correct. And the reason they said it was technically correct because it is correct, and that means that there will be £9.1 billion more in the Scottish Government's coffers from the 1st of April next year.
Thank you. I have a supplementary from Angus MacDonald.
Minister, can I suggest that in Scotland some of the Scottish businesses are getting the worst of both worlds? So there are aspects that are happening which are imposed on us by the Scottish Government, which are very painful. For example, a higher income tax. We didn't get business rates relief for a level of hospitality and retail, etc. And yet we're imposed on things which may be appropriate for the 9/10 of our population based in England, which are not appropriate for Scotland. For example, the national insurance increase has hurt hospitality in the Highlands extremely hard, and hospitality is the biggest sector in the Highlands. So we're getting hit twice. On the energy, you guys are coming up with a subsidy for high energy users, which is great if you're one of those organisations or sectors that get high energy. But we are paying in rural Scotland massive prices for our energy, and we're not getting that subsidy. So I rather feel that in rural Scotland we're getting the worst of both worlds, and I would hope that the Scottish office would stand up for us when that sort of negotiation happens, because we're getting hit from the Scottish Government and also by the Westminster Government.
Yeah, if I may, Chair. So this is something that's been mentioned quite a lot by all the different stakeholders that we've been engaging with, and as you know, we've done huge numbers of kind of roundtables and engagement sessions in QH and in Dover House, but also we've been out and about speaking to people. And the thing that external stakeholders keep saying to me is the cumulative impact of policy that you've just described, that at the business end, the sharp end, when they're trying to run their organisation or run their business, they are, as you say, experiencing the cumulative impact of local government decision-making, Scottish government decision-making and UK government decision-making. And the thing that we've been very keen to stress is that is not for organisations to navigate. It's for those of us on the government side of the table, whatever level of government we're operating at, to sort out in advance what we anticipate the cumulative impact of decisions to be. They may be perfectly sensible in their own terms, but when they layer upon layer upon layer, the effect may be not as we intended. So the thing I would say to reassure you is we are in constant dialogue with Scottish Government and with COSLA at a local government level to try and anticipate the cumulative effect of those policies. The reset, we hope, is a really helpful foundation for that. But the other thing, just going back to the previous question, Chair, if I may, mission-based government, we hope, is helpful for that as well, because the other thing that people are saying is, historically, we find it very difficult to navigate UK government because there's lots of different departments who aren't necessarily working together. Mission-based government means that they are working together, and the spending review was a more collegiate experience than, I may say, the last time I worked in government, because the decisions were made against the basis of, do these help us hit government objectives, not departmental objectives. So I hope that our approach, which is mission-based and based on a foundational reset with Scottish Government, means we will anticipate these kind of layered experiences that people are having a bit faster than we have historically. But the door is always open for people to surface for us if we haven't got that right on our government side of the table.
And there's a great opportunities in terms of the rural communities in Scotland, because the clean energy by 2030 is a massive opportunity. In fact, the opportunity would be so large that the infrastructure might not cope in terms of housing, connectivity, roads, etc. And those are the kind of things we're working in partnership with the Scottish Government to deliver. Disappointed that businesses didn't get the rates relief that other businesses got, and we're just about to legislate to make that permanent in England as well. The industrial strategy has been launched. You'll see it's very much got a rural focus in it, particularly in Scotland. We've got the spaceport, the best spaceport in Europe in the north of Shetland, which I think you've visited. So the rural isn't being excluded from anything that's happening. And I do just gently remind the member that, you know, I fully accept, appreciate, acknowledge and understand the arguments about employers' national insurance, but none of the conversation that we're having at the moment, and from Madam Chair's initial questions about the record block grant, the investment in Acorn, the investment in the supercomputer, none of that would have happened without stabilising the economy. And the difficult decision to increase employers' national insurance was all part of that stability. And that stability needs credibility, it needs certainty, and that means we can make these investments both in public services and in the economy, which will help rural areas. Without any of that, none of this would be happening at all. And I would fully expect your questions to be much harder and much harsher if we weren't making these investments in the economy and in public services.
Just to complete on that one, the renewable energy is definitely, potentially, a good thing for rural Britain, but it is definitely not happening now. The turbines are made overseas, the owners are very international, the community benefits are not really coming through in the way we'd hoped they were, and there isn't the jobs in it. So I'd like that to be on record.
Apart from that, everything's fine. I mean, the biggest challenge we have is in the supply chain. And not just in terms of creating that capacity in supply chains across Scotland and the whole of the UK, but also providing that pipeline of projects so that the supply chain can be robust and have that certainty in their order book. I mean, Sumitomo Electric is an example in the Highlands in terms of making those cables. They're building a factory, investing in the supply chain. They now need those pipeline of orders. Those pipeline of orders will only come in if we can get the consenting and the planning right for the clean energy mission. So all of this is a jigsaw that has to come together at the same time. But I take a slightly opposite view to yourself in the sense that I see this as being a huge opportunity rather than a huge problem.
A further supplementary from Harriet Cross.
Thank you. Just a very quick one, Secretary of State. You said that it was your understanding that the NIC's increase had stabilised the economy. Is that what you said, and is that really the case that is being made for NICs? Because certainly from what I'm hearing on the ground, and I don't think I'll be alone in this, it has not stabilised the economy at all. It's put an absolute spanner in the works of a lot of businesses, a lot of rural businesses in particular. Jobs are being lost, jobs are not being created. There's no figures in the economy at the moment that actually shows that the economy is being stabilised or strengthened in any way. How is the claim that the NIC's change has stabilised the economy one that can credibly be made? Well,
I mean, at the election, we inherited an economy that was in complete and utter chaos. Public finances were in chaos. We had an industrial crisis across Scotland and the rest of the UK. And we had to make some pretty tough decisions to stabilise that by filling the £22 billion black hole, by stabilising
that black hole has not been credited by the OBR. They do not say that's a black hole.
By stabilising the economy. Well, you can wish it away as much as you wish to do
so,
but government had to take a responsibility.
How has the NIC's changes filled that black hole?
Because we had to raise taxes in order to be able to invest in our public services and the economy. The budget in October put £40 billion extra into our public services because they were on their knees, whether it be the NHS, whether it be education, whether transport infrastructure, and £100 billion into capital investment. That had to be paid for. We had to make some pretty difficult decisions to do that, but stabilising the economy means that we've been able to have 4 interest rate cuts from the Bank of England because the economy is stable. We've been able to get record investment into the economy, be able to produce an industrial strategy which is about investment into sectors to grow our economy. We had the highest growth at 0.7% of the G7. So everything in terms of the indicators are looking much more positive. But the key thing that businesses told us, at the election is they want stability, they want credibility, and they want investment in the economy, and that's what we've delivered. That takes money to do so, and I've yet to hear a proposal that suggests that we take that £25 billion out of the economy, and what do we replace it with, or what do we cut? So if there is if the committee want to come to a conclusion in terms of what we cut from the economy, if we take that £25 billion out, I'm very happy to receive that. But it seems to me that the criticisms are that everybody wants the spending, of which we'll talk about a lot of that today, but nobody wants to raise the money for it, and government has to make those decisions to do so.
No, I think the criticism. Sorry, just one final point.
Briefly, please.
I think the criticism is that it was, as you said yourself, a £25 billion tax rate on businesses, which they were not prepared for, and they are bearing the brunt of. And it is jobs and working people who are paying the cost, and that is not stabilising the economy. We will see employment decreasing. We've already seen unemployment rates go up in May, which was exactly the month after the next changes came in. Businesses aren't hiring, and they're the ones who will be growing the economy. So I just do not take on board your fact, or the point that you made, that that's changed. The next increase has stabilised the economy.
Well, wages are up more in the last 10 months than they have been in the last 10 years, and therefore there is more money in people's pockets. That's what we promised we would do at the election. The number one thing for businesses is to make sure that the public has more disposable income, and that's what we're determined to deliver.
Susan Murray.
So it's just to carry on the point of the national insurance, because the increase in employer national insurance is not just hitting small businesses, it's hitting the charitable sector as well, where they are not employing people, where they're losing jobs. And that sector is the sector that broadly will help people back into jobs. And so when you've got a situation, you're creating a perfect storm where small businesses, small local businesses, are shrinking because they cannot afford to employ extra people. They sometimes can't afford to employ the people that they've got. They're cutting back on apprenticeships. And yet we're looking for these small businesses to help people go back to work if they've been on long-term disability and they need that support to get back into work. So I'm afraid we're not going to agree. I don't think that the national insurance rise, it was the only way that we could have found the money. There is possibilities to reverse tax cuts for banks, to tax the digital giants. There are other ways to look at this, and I think time will tell what this is actually doing to our economy with the increase in employer national insurance.
Well, there was £140 billion went into the economy from the budget, and £330 billion more than was being projected by the previous government that went into the spending review. So that's an investment in our public services. That's ending the austerity that has damaged all of our economies, and it's trying to put more money into people's pockets, which means people will have more customers. So there is no easy answer to these difficult questions, but the bottom line is that we do have a huge focus on growing the economy, which means investing in businesses, investing in sectors, investing in people, so there can be more jobs, higher paid jobs with highly skilled individuals with career paths to have them. That is the whole purpose of the mission to grow the economy, which is the number one mission of this government. And don't forget that most small businesses have relief on national insurance contributions, and 850,000 businesses across the whole of the UK will either pay less or the same national insurance as they were paying before.
So, okay, thank you. So if I just move on then to ask how you respond to the Institute for Public Policy's Scotland's analysis that the average increase of 1.1% per year in the block grant is unlikely to meet Scotland's ongoing fiscal challenges.
Well, I'm not responsible for Scotland's ongoing fiscal challenges. That's the decision of the Scottish Government to determine their own budgets. What I can do is to make sure that Scotland gets its fair share and gets the investment that we all want to see, and you can see that through the spending review. So having come into since we came into government almost 12 months ago, the Scottish Government has received £4.9 billion extra, and will receive an extra £9.1 billion. That's 2.7% increase every year in real terms. That's a significant investment in making sure that we could end austerity in Scotland. But I'm not responsible for Scotland's fiscal challenges, and indeed the fiscal challenges are there for all to see. There's been report after report of unallocated spending, unbalanced spending, and I think if you talk to some of the organisations that you mentioned in your supplementary question earlier, the charitable sector, the third sector, are still being underfunded despite the record funding. So people will rightly ask, if there are fiscal challenges in Scotland, why is that the case? And secondly, where is the money gone?
I think to some extent you've answered the next question, but do you see it as part of your role to secure a settlement that meets Scotland's longer term and structural fiscal challenges? Well,
it's absolutely our role in the Scotland office to do so, and in fact it's the UK government's role too. And I think we split that into three pots. One is the fiscal events that we have, whether it be budgets or spending reviews. We're very much at the heart of that, championing Scotland's corner, as every MP in this room does, of whatever political colour. Secondly, there's huge opportunities for Scotland in terms of the missions of the UK government, because green energy will be disproportionate in Scotland, as an example. And thirdly, major UK spending that's not included in things like Barnett numbers and block grants, like on defence spending, which will disproportionately benefit Scotland, spending through GB Energy. So there's government departments that are reserved that are spending billions and billions and billions in Scotland that is not included in these kind of block grant figures. So it's really important for us to fight Scotland's corner, but there's a real recognition across Whitehall that Scotland's hugely important, not just the contribution it makes, but the contribution we can make in return.
The Scottish Government has claimed that the UK Government offered limited engagement ahead of the spending review, despite extensive representations. What was the Treasury's approach to engaging with the Scottish Government during the spending review process, and what was your role in this?
There's a number of answers to that question, Ms Burke, in terms of the formal processes, the informal process, and then actually what happens in terms of the budget processes. So there is the Finance Interministerial Standing Committee, the FISC, which the Chief Secretary of the Treasury chairs with the finance ministers of all the devolved administrations. We sit on that along with our Secretary of State colleagues of Wales and Northern Ireland, and there's an open discussion throughout the course of the year at various set pieces, whether it be for the budget, the spending review or otherwise. So there's that formal process. There's lots of other formal ministerial standing committees that are for the devolved administrations that feed in individual policy issues as well. In terms of the spending review, there's been letters exchanged, there's been meetings that have been had, there's been exploratory meetings, not just with the Scottish Government, but with COSLA and others. We have conducted our own, but also the Treasury have done theirs as well, and individual departments in terms of their spending profiles in the Scottish context. The Cabinet Secretary was informed of the spending review at the appropriate time when everyone else was informed, which was about 10:30, I think, on the day of the spending review. I don't say this flippantly, we weren't quite. There was a Scottish Government reshuffle going on at the time, so we weren't quite sure if that meeting was going to go ahead or whether or not the Finance Secretary would be there. So there's lots of discussion, and I think it's utterly ludicrous for the Scottish Government to essentially say there's been no representation when there's extensive representations that are happening all the time. There's extensive cross-government working, both at official level and political level. I probably meet with the Deputy First Minister more than I meet with any other politician in terms of discussing these issues and other issues that are relevant to Scotland. And I mainly just gently press back, although not the responsibility of this committee, that the Cabinet Secretary, as I understand, is making a statement on the Scottish Government's budget today, and we haven't been informed what's in it.
Can I, Chair, if I may? So I should just put on record that the Secretary of State is right there. I think he spends more time with the DFM than he does with me. So the ongoing discussions are very regular and a sincere attempt to kind of take each other's temperature in mind. I think it's very interesting that there's this focus on the processology of how many meetings have been had with what agenda, when of course Scotland's representatives have on the floor of the House of Commons made repeated representations as to what they'd like to see in the spending review, and those representations have been heard and well taken, which is why we've ended up with an ACORN investment. It's why we've ended up with £750 million for a supercomputer. It's why we've ended up with record amounts of money going into Scottish public services. So the idea that Scotland's voice has not been heard just doesn't tally with the outcome of this spending review, and I don't think it's an accident that the Scottish Government wants to talk about the process rather than the outcome, because it's plain for all to see that the outcome for Scotland was great from the spending review.
I mean, I know members will be very keen on other examples to give us some colour to what we're trying to say, but the Strategic Defence and Security Review was launched in Glasgow on, I think it was Monday the 2nd of June. There was a high-level security briefing on the Defence Review offered to the First Minister on that before it was launched by the Prime Minister. The First Minister declined that meeting and went campaigning in Hamilton instead. So, sometimes the engagement works both ways.
Thanks for that. I think you've actually answered my supplementary, which was about what lessons can be learned from future spending rounds, but I think you've sort of covered a part of that, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cross.
Thank you very much. As you've already mentioned in the spending review, we saw that there was money for the ACON project, which is obviously welcome, but there was no decision on the final investment decision, other than saying it will be sometime this Parliament when the affordability and readiness is understood. Why has that been delayed, and when will the final decision be taken? Because, as I'm sure you're very aware, these projects are ready to go. There's only so long businesses can hold on to workers effectively when a project has been done, whether either that's going to be an internal delay or letting people go because they can't just wait around for a government to make a decision. So when will those come forward?
I don't think anybody can deny the commitment to carbon capture and storage that this government has. We've committed £21.8 billion to the Track 1 projects. ACON is probably, it's officially a Track 2 project, it's probably a Track 1.1 project in terms of being the next in the line, and that £200 million in the spending review was to get it to a stage of a final investment decision, which would probably happen at the next spending review or the one after. So the next spending review will be in 2027 or indeed in 2029. It's a 3-year spending review on a 2-year rolling basis. And we've been working with the partners. This hasn't just been plucked out of the air. All of the partners that we had a round table with were looking for that development funding in terms of to get it to a stage of final investment decision. And it was the partners we worked with that came up with the figure that they were looking for in the spending review, and that's the figure that the DESNES put into their spending review submission. So this is all part of the process to get to final investment decision, and that will be considered either at the next spending review or the one after, depending on how much development has got on and what stage it's got to. But the partners are very much involved in this and very much driving the process.
So what concerns, if any, do the government have on affordability and readiness, if that is what's going to drive the decision?
Well, look, actually, the big question is about affordability and readiness, and that's what this money is to be there for, to get it to a stage whereby it can be looked at as a final investment decision. There is no doubt the ACON project has many fantastic attributes. It has the St Fergus terminal, it has the pipelines, it has Grangemouth, it has the infrastructure, it has the skills and the workforce. It has all the partners involved in this. It has a significant amount of investment that's happened already. So this is a really exciting project, and the £200 million is to get it to a stage whereby it can be ready to go, and that's what the partners were looking for, and that's what we've delivered as a government. So there should be no ambiguity at all about this government's commitment to both carbon capture and storage or the ACON project, and certainly we'll be making sure that £200 million is well spent as quickly as possible in order to get to that final investment decision, hopefully by the spending review in 2027.
And sorry, just to go back a step, you suggested that ACON was sort of a Track 1 plus, and therefore, sort of by association, Viking might be seen as a Track 2 minus if they're at the same time. So would you expect Viking to come on then after, in a later FID for that one, or a later spending review?
Well, Viking's been funded in the same way for development funding, through the same pot. So I think it was a £350 million pot.
You're seeing them both as being...
I'll check the figure for you, but they're both being given the development funding to get to final investment decision. So I wouldn't want one project to be over the other. I'm just highlighting the fact that ACON was always technically a Track 2 project, but actually it was a Track 1.1. It was just behind the other 2 projects that we fully funded.
Thank you. And finally, just on hydrogen, which has obviously also included the projects in the spending review, but there was no, unless I'm wrong, funding allocated to that. When might that be known, and what sort of projects would you be looking at?
Well, actually, Scotland's punched above its weight in terms of the hydrogen sector. There was a number of in the call for projects to come forward for the funding. There's 11 UK projects, 8 of which have been shortlisted in Scotland. There's a £2 billion package on the table, and the shortlisted for the second hydrogen allocation round has been announced, and the successful projects, as I understand it, I don't have a timeline here, It just says announced in due course, and of course in government terms I've learnt that spring means the 1st of January to 31st of December, so it will be done in due course, but the due diligence process is happening. The cost assurance process has to sit alongside that. The allocation round is in place in terms of that £2 billion, and Scotland's punching above its weight, so I suspect Scotland will do very well, disproportionately well out of this, for a number of reasons. One, the accessibility of renewables, but also in terms of the development of the hydrogen sector in Scotland.
So companies sort of waiting on this, developers waiting on this, are very much sort of finger in the air, just waiting until a time comes along. There is no time for it at the moment.
Well, again, it's not finger in the air, because this government's made a huge commitment to hydrogen, both in the spending review and in the budget, and therefore nobody can, again, I can give that 100% reassurance that government is working at pace to get to a position whereby we can fund these projects and get hydrogen up and running as quickly as possible, because, again, Scotland will disproportionately benefit.
And are you working to try and tie down a date?
Well, we're working very hard to try and get all these projects over the line as quickly as possible. The spending review was part of that process, of course. The hydrogen allocation round was part of that process. We were over the moon that so many projects came forward, and the disproportionately high level of Scottish projects that were shortlisted. So yes, I mean, DESNES are working at pace to get this over the line as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Yes.
Dave Duggan.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Secretary of State. I think I listened to your analysis of ACON and its position within the two tracks. And I think, not the least of whom will be the investors, there will be people in Scotland who will look at the readiness of ACON to deliver on the carbon capture and utilisation and storage prospectus, but being demoted to whatever you want to call it, track 1 plus, it's track 2. And also this £200 million funding to get its business case fully tightened up pales into insignificance for the 22 odd billion that's been invested in Highnet and Merseyside and Teesside. And I think a lot of people in Scotland will recognise that £350 billion of revenue from Scotland's oil and gas flowed to the Treasury over the last 15 years from Scotland, not from Merseyside or Teesside. So part of the pooling and sharing narrative of unionism, which says, we should pool and share our resources and our risks. Scotland's resources have been pooled down to the Treasury, all right, but the resources aren't getting shared beyond Merseyside or Teesside. Is that a fair assessment of what's been happening?
No.
You want to elaborate on that?
Well, look, let me go back to ACON. The honourable gentleman can talk down the ACON project if he so wishes to do so, but you used the word demoted. It hasn't been demoted. There's always been a track 1 and a track 2 process here. Track 1 has been fully funded. That went through approvals because it has its readiness. Track 2, although it's not necessarily a track 2, and it's always been said to ACON that they were right behind next in the queue, has been funded to get it to that stage, and there's a commitment from government for carbon capture and storage. So I see ACON as being a huge opportunity, not a burden. It's a fantastic. It has all the infrastructure, better infrastructure than some of the track 1 projects.
Why isn't it track 1?
Well, that was a decision that was made with the previous government, but I think it came down to the fact that the heavy industries in the cluster around the track 1 projects were a much more readier source of carbon than the ACON project itself, despite the fact that ACON had the infrastructure. It didn't necessarily have the level and volume of feedstocks that the track 1 processes had, but we can again write to you to clarify that, but as I understand that was the process for it. And in terms of funding, look, the Scottish Parliament rightly spends its money as it so wishes to do so. Scotland receives £2,300 per person more than England in terms of funding for its public services. There's a record settlement for the Scottish Government, £52 billion a year, £9.1 billion in terms of spending on the block grant. But as I said in the answer to Ms Murray's question, there is an awful lot of UK government spending in Scotland that isn't included in that block grant, including defence, including things like energy, including things like AMI spending in terms of whether that's for social security or pensions. So there's a huge amount of money that's spent in Scotland, and we do very well in terms of punching above our weight because we contribute to that UK pot, and we also pool and share those resources. So I don't necessarily accept the way in which Mr Duggan has put the question, because I don't believe that to be true. I think Scotland does incredibly well out of pooling and sharing resources across the whole of the United Kingdom.
Next question is from Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, the spending review, announced a £250 million investment in HM Naval Base Clyde, or Fast Lane, which is on the boundary of my West Dunbartonshire constituency. 6,500 civilian and service personnel are employed there directly, with over 10,000 jobs across the wider economy, the vast majority of which are in my constituency. What will the £250 million over the next 3 years be spent on, and will that help secure and support Scottish jobs?
I mean, thank you for the question. Madam Chair, I don't want to spend any time at this committee talking about global instability, because everyone knows that that's the case. But maybe I just use that as the first sentence to segue into the fact, from a Scotland Office perspective, all of that is incredibly important. But we've seen the increase in defence spending and the commitments made to the Faslane Naval Base in the spending review as part of our jobs and growth agenda. So there's a huge opportunity to get a defence dividend for Scotland, and of course your constituency and neighbouring constituencies on the west coast of Scotland would benefit from that hugely. In terms of the £250 million additional funding, it is for the base itself. It's the investment to improve the working environment at the base and the infrastructure that's on site, preparing it, of course, for the new submarines and indeed the AUKUS project. It's a big commitment from the UK government to acknowledge the importance of the naval base at Clyde, but also in terms of the future defence spending and the future posture of the UK in terms of that nuclear deterrent.
Thank you. You mentioned the AUKUS agreement, which will of course support defence jobs right across Scotland. Is there any fear at government level that the US will review this agreement, which would obviously be concerning for Scottish defence sector jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Prime Minister and government have been very clear that the decisions on defence spending here are driven by the fact that we have to drive forward a much clearer and much more locally grown defence in that sense. So yes, supporting NATO as being sacrosanct and the international alliances that we have, but also standing on our own 2 feet, and that was why the commitment was there to increase defence spending to 2.6% in 27, and of course to sign up to the 5% that NATO is discussing today or tomorrow, I think, at the NATO summit that's happening in The Hague this week. So the US is our closest security and defence ally. There's intelligence sharing happening between the US and the UK on an intra-daily basis in all 4 corners of the globe. So that AUKUS project is really, really important to that, of course, bringing Australia into that process as well. But our own defence in terms of the contribution that the naval base at Clyde provides to that is completely critical, not just to the UK and to wider allies, but also to our NATO involvement as well.
Thank you.
Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, could you give us a bit of an update about the relationship between you, the Scottish Office, and the Scottish Government in relation to the investment zones and green free ports in Scotland?
Yes, I mean, it's very positive. We've discussed this at committee before. The Prime Minister, 72 hours after the general election, hot-footed it to Scotland, as he had promised to do, to meet with the First Minister to make it very clear that he wanted to reset the relationship between the UK and Scottish governments on the basis that the relationship hadn't been good before between both governments, but also having an adversarial relationship would not deliver the mutual aims and goals that both governments have to improve the lives of people in Scotland. And the missions that we have as a government can only be delivered in the Scottish context by working hand in glove. Green Mission as an example, through planning, consenting and the devolved and reserved matters that lie alongside that. So we're working very, very closely together. The relationship has been reset rather than resetting the relationship. And we're working very closely to make sure we can build on some of the strengths that we have in the Scottish context. We're also, of course, working with local leaders. The governance structures around the green free ports, for example, and the investment zones have built up over many years through the deal processes, so that those governance structures are working well. We're meeting with them both individually and together to maximise the benefits of those 4 investment zone and green free ports in the Scottish context. And the Crombie Firth Freeport has been fully approved now by both the UK and Scottish governments in terms of its business case. That full business case has been signed off. And the good news is from that business case that both governments agree, both independently and collectively, that it will generate £6 billion for the local economy and 18,000 jobs. The challenge is now to get this done at pace, get as many jobs in as possible, and make sure the infrastructure is there for those people to be able to work and live in the Highlands and Islands.
I do know that your colleague, Kirsty McNeill, gave a very useful briefing to the Highland MPs yesterday, which was really appreciated by everybody who attended it. Can I just touch on one other thing which is related to that? It is felt quite widely that the major cities are benefiting from, say, the Inverness City deal and the Inverness Cromarty Greenport. The major cities are reasonably prosperous in comparison to rural Scotland, where we have very high energy prices, our transport infrastructure is rubbish, our ferries are worse. There's a centralisation of public services in the cities. We have a fast ageing population, our school rolls are collapsing. Remote in particular, Scotland is having a catastrophic time. And I wonder if you would comment about how the Scottish Office could help those areas.
No, if I could, Chair. So I found it very useful as well yesterday having the conversation with all of you. One of the things I am charged with, partly because of the allocation of portfolios inside the Scotland Office and partly because of the Scotland Office role across the UK government, is impressing on all colleagues with decision-making power across government the rurality of Scotland. I think if I could land with every government department one thing about Scotland, it would be that the nature of our rurality means that decision-making does need to be sensitive to that, and myself and Ian spend a lot of time championing that across government. The thing that has come out from these sessions that we've been doing with different groups of MPs on the growth deals, and every member of the committee that represents a Scottish seat should have had an invite to one of those already, and we'll do a wash-up one for those of you who weren't able to make it, to make sure you all have access to the same information at the same time. One of the trends that's become very clear over those conversations is exactly the anxiety that you've described, that the deals do best for the places at the centre of them, and the periphery of the deals are not benefiting as much. We just need to dive into the data to check whether that's true. So we've given an undertaking as the Scotland Office that we'll do that. We'll kind of scrub the data to make sure whether that's an impression or a reality, and we'll share that with the committee and with all Scottish MPs, because we just need to know, and officials will get that to you as soon as we've done the analysis.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to offer the reassurance that the Scotland Office across the board, members of staff are all very well aware of the rural needs, and as a Highlander myself, I can absolutely reassure you that the needs of rural Scotland are taken into consideration in every conversation we have.
You might be very pleased with our director appointment that's just about to be announced in terms of her location.
I've waited for excitement. Am I going to be made minister?
They can.
You can bring out the champagne next time, Angus.
Whiskey.
Dave, you've got a supplementary.
Thanks, Minister. Very much. In terms of Angus's point about collapsing school roles and challenges recruiting to service sector employers in rural settings in Scotland and actually urban settings, it's a demographic one, isn't it? It's about there aren't enough people to fill those roles, and the problem that we have in Scotland is we can either breed our way to a higher population, or we can have policies which invite people to come and make themselves new Scots, living and contributing to the economy and society of Scotland. But the problem Scotland has is that while we remain in the Union, we will always have the immigration policy that England wants, and England wants a very different future than Scotland wants. So how do we square that circle while we remain in Union?
I'm astonished that that's your second question, and you've mentioned independence twice. But look, this is well, not really, but I thought for the record. Look, we've had this debate in the House of Commons when we had that debate with the private members bill from your colleague, and there are bigger challenges to think about in terms of the depopulation of Scotland. For example, and we've heard some of those already from Mr MacDonald, there's huge opportunities, but is there the infrastructure and housing for people to be able to take up those opportunities? I suspect the answer to that is no. In fact, you've seen the reports today, despite the housing emergency being declared in the Scottish Parliament by the Scottish Government, there is house buildings dropping and continuing to drop to record low levels. And if we do have net migration in the country of 900,000, which was the figure 2 years ago, it's obviously dropped since, why do we not have the pool of people to come into Scotland from those figures? So the quantum of people doesn't seem to be the problem, because the quantum is coming in record numbers, even more than we were in the European Union. And secondly, how do we sort the infrastructure issues to make sure that places, particularly most rural and remote, are not only attractive places for people to go, but there are jobs, opportunities and infrastructure to support people whilst they are there. So there's a whole host. This isn't just a one-stop shop in terms of trying to find a single solution to this. This has got to be a plethora across a whole host of solutions, whether it be public services, public infrastructure, public policy and migration. And I have yet to see a significant or a satisfactory answer to if net migration is at its highest levels in history, why there is still depopulation in Scotland.
Did you want to come in, Minister?
If I could just add another practical thing. One of the other things that's emerged from these conversations we've been having on the basis of the growth deal regions is we need another mechanism for parliamentarians to talk to government regionally and not just rely on being able to ask questions on the floor of the House or in settings like this. So I made an undertaking yesterday that we're going to set up regionalised cross-party groups of MPs so that we can dig into, not through the prism of the growth deal, but through the prism of all the levers that are available to all levels of government, the challenges in the Highlands and Islands with depopulation, the challenges in the North East with the oil and gas transition, and so on. So we need to give you a mechanism where we can really do a deep dive into what is happening and what we need to have happen. And I say the growth deal has been the mechanism to have that conversation so far, but I think we actually need something wider, so we will crack on with organising that from the Scotland office.
Supplementary from Angus MacDonald.
The Highland Council came up with in a report that 50% of the young want to leave the Highlands when they finish their education. We know that we have an enormous number of jobs coming through from transmission lines, renewables, etc. One very easy and cheap solution would be to set up STEM colleges within the existing UHI network in Fawley and Portrees, Stornoway, which would allow people to train for those jobs. So at the moment they're very arts-based, and a very small amount, say even £5 million, would allow that to happen, and that would make a very big difference.
Can I just make a general comment on that? Because actually when we've been talking to growth deal partners about what the next stage of growth deals look like, one of the key things has been that yes, it's all about a quantum of money, etc., but actually one of the key drivers of what could happen for local growth, and particularly in the examples you give, is the devolution of skills. So, for example, I know the Edinburgh City region deal very well because that's where I'm based and where I live, but they want skills and transport devolved to them so they can do that on a much local level, and I think that kind of devolution to the kind of remote and rural areas you're talking about would really help that skills agenda. And the two things from that, the Highlands and Islands Council obviously have been speaking to us a lot, and their biggest driver now is to try and get to those 24,000 new homes in the Highlands and Islands so people have somewhere to live. There was a Scottish Affairs Select Committee report by one of your predecessor committees, probably in 2016, that talked very clearly about the depopulation and what was driving those numbers, and the largest element of those is 19 to 26-year-olds leaving either after tertiary education or higher education south to Manchester and mainly London for jobs and opportunities. So if we can crack the opportunities part and we can do something about the skills part and the infrastructure part, we might be at least in with a shout of trying to reverse some of that depopulation, particularly in young people.
I shall have you made a peer as a result of this help. Thank you.
Okay. I had planned to ask you, Secretary of State, if the increase in funding for the Scotland Office reflected a strategic shift in the department's role, but I think you've identified that when you were talking about the cross-cutting nature of it. So can I ask then how those increases can be justified given the drive for efficiencies across other departments in the UK government?
Well, there's obviously a drive for efficiencies in the sense of what the government's been trying to do through the spending reviews to shift the day-to-day spending from administration in government departments to frontline priorities in terms of programme budgets. We've been no different to that in the Scotland Office. In fact, Brand Scotland's our biggest programme budget, and that's been fully funded now to the tune of £3 million to the end of that spending review process, and is doing a lot of great stuff. So is there a justification to make? Not really, because there's a number of things that fall from that. One is Scotland's incredibly important, not just for delivering the UK government's missions, but it's just incredibly important, full stop. There's a recognition across Whitehall, both at civil service and political level, including around the cabinet table, how important Scotland is. and how much of a contribution that will make towards our national missions. And the third thing is that the Scotland Office, in terms of a department of Whitehall, punches well above its weight. And don't underestimate the power of not just having 37 MPs sitting on the government benches making the case, but also having Scottish MPs across the chamber making the case for whether it be the Acorn project. I know Mr Dugan asked about that at Scottish Questions a number of months ago, or whether it's on oil and gas and the investment in the North East. So the contribution that Scottish MPs are making generally is hugely important, but don't underestimate the power of 37 Scottish Labour MPs sitting on the government benches, impressing on the government how important Scotland is.
Thank you.
And do you want
Sorry.
Well, I just to add from a sort of departmental perspective, I would reassure that we are always seeking efficiencies, and the department over recent years has done things like combined services with colleagues in the territorial office in Wales. We share financial services. We're always looking to push down our costs in terms of travel and T&S and so on, and using technology wherever possible to be more efficient in the way we deliver for the public.
Thank you. We're now going to move on to some questions about Brand Scotland, so I'll hand over to Maureen Burke.
Can I ask, why was the Brand Scotland programme publicly announced in the autumn budget before the full business case had been approved by the Treasury? And what assurances were in place at that stage to ensure value for money and deliverability of the programme objectives?
Yeah, I mean, this is normally what happens in terms of the processes. So you would make a bid to Treasury for the funding for a particular project, and they would determine whether or not in principle they would support that. And of course the budget announcement in that sense is the principle when the Treasury are saying through the Chancellor we will support this project, and then the department has to develop the full business case to justify what we're trying to do, and that then happens in the following few months in the run up to the start of the financial year, when the funding becomes available. The full business case was easily approved by Treasury because a very, very strong business case, and then the funds have been released, and we've been already taking Brand Scotland around the world regardless. Even before the full business case was approved, we were in Malaysia and Singapore. We launched it in Norway. We've been to New York, to Tartan Week for Washington and New York. Minister McNeill led an all-women delegation to Spain last month, the start of this month. So the Brand Scotland project is very much growing arms and legs. We've just written to all UK missions across the world, offering some funding if any businesses, Scottish businesses are in the region or want to export to the region, and through the embassy and missions they can then fund some activity on the ground. So it's a huge project. The world's a big place. £3 million doesn't sound a lot, but actually in the context of the Scotland Office it's allowing us to do an awful lot with our FCDO colleagues, our trade colleagues, and through exporting.
Thanks for that. It's good to see that it's been promoted worldwide. Thank you.
Of course.
Thanks, Secretary of State. In the UK context, what regions of the United Kingdom in terms of branding could Scotland learn anything from?
In terms of across the world, or in terms
of global reach and prominence, where in the UK is showing Scotland how it's done?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
So, I mean, Scotland Office is driving Brand Scotland. That will be true for the Department for Trade and FCDO subsidiary to that, for other areas of the United Kingdom. I just wonder where else in the United Kingdom is outperforming Scotland in branding terms.
Well, I suppose that the genesis of Brand Scotland was the fact that, and everyone will know this, wherever you go in the world and you talk about Scotland, people automatically think of and imagine the products that we have here. So whisky, salmon, tartan, our cultural experiences. There'll be probably some professional services in there as well because of the footprint across the world. So we thought, in the development of Brand Scotland, we thought, why don't we exploit those door openers in order for us to be able to get more exporting, encourage more Scottish business to export, get more inward investment, but also to allow the UK government to use its massive footprint. You know, there's missions pretty much in every part of the world to help us exploit that. And there's kind of, when I was a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and ever went to a foreign mission, particularly in places like China, there seemed to be a bit of a silo. You know, this is Scottish and therefore SCDI would do that, or one of the Scottish bodies would do that. We've broken that down now, so we're working hand in glove with the Business for Trade and indeed the FCDO. And we're trailblazers in this because in the spending review, the Welsh office got Brand Wales funding, so they're going to start this project. And really, the other genesis of it is I was very frustrated whenever I went anywhere in the world, particularly to North America. We had this huge diaspora community, but we didn't do anything as well as the Irish. You know, St Patrick's Day is huge. It's a massive opportunity for Irish businesses to be part of that global scene. So we're trying to emulate that, and we're trying to make sure we can use the full force of the UK network.
So is Brand Scotland the UK's principal brand?
No, the Great campaign is the UK's principal brand. That's been running now for the best part of 2 decades, I think, and therefore that runs parallel with the Great campaign. But we cross-contaminate each other. And what we're trying to do with Brand Scotland is to make sure that whenever the Great campaign is doing something, Brand Scotland is part of it. The Expo in Japan being a really good example of where we sent the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo out there to be part of Brand Scotland as part of the UK Expo. So it's about working together and getting most bang for our buck. We've only got £3 million. The FCDO and the Department of Trade have not only many multiples of that, but they also have a big, much larger network.
Right across.
Thank you. Why will you not be publishing a strategy for Brand Scotland? And if you don't do that, how can we have any idea of how it's being spent in terms of taxpayers' money, deliverables, like how are we going to measure it? Will there be reports in this year's account? What are they going to focus on?
Yeah, well, Brand Scotland will be reported as part of the Scotland Office annual report, as would always be the case. And it's got to be a really flexible programme because what we're trying to do is one part of it, one of the biggest elements of it, we're trying to encourage Scottish exporters to export more, and Scottish exporters who are perhaps thinking about exporting but haven't done it yet to start exporting, and we can help be some of the seed support for that, but also some of the seed funding for that. We're also trying to make sure that the big trade deals that have been signed with the US, the EU and India are exploited by Scottish businesses and they get the most out of it. And we're also leading trade missions, as Minister McNeill has done to Spain with the all-women trade mission earlier this month. So it has to be designed fluidly, and we've set up a fund delivered through I think it's 168 missions across the world, where businesses can apply for between £3,000 and £20,000 of grant funding to do events in country and develop those relationships. So it's very much a fluid programme. It's defined, of course, by the budget that we have, which is £750,000 a year. It's unique in terms of our soft power because there are some immeasurables in here. We've signed a strategic partnership with the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo as a door opener. We've just signed a big £100,000 strategic partnership with the Scottish Chambers of Commerce to use their networks internationally. And all of that will be reported in the Scotland Office annual report, as would be the case normally.
Let me, Chair. Yeah, if I could just add on. One of the reasons the strategy is emergent is because it's supposed to prime innovation. So there's a pot of funding available to our overseas network to come forward with ideas because they know their markets best. So we're hoping to kind of surface all that expertise around the world. And I just wanted to impress upon committee members just how impressed we have been when we have been overseas on these trade missions, not just with the open door you get, because a kind of Scottish produce is a hallmark of quality. So there's a real sort of affection, as you'll know, for Scotland around the world amongst those business partners, but also the overseas network is absolutely raring to go to help Scottish businesses export. So if you do have businesses in your areas who want to export, the network is so expert and so enthused by the fact they've been offered this opportunity to innovate.
Okay, so sorry, just to confirm, because it sounded like you were both saying slightly different things. Will there be a strategy published? Is there one coming, or is it just there is just never going to be a published strategy?
Well, we have the full business case that has been approved by the Treasury, which sets out what we're trying to achieve with the money. And broadly 3 pots, the first pot being trade missions, the second pot being to help and encourage exporters to export more, and the third pot being to try and encourage inward investment. So there's three pots to this, and the business case is there for us. That drives us forward because that's the approved business case by both the Department and the Treasury. So that's why we're able to do the kind of activity that Minister McNeill has just highlighted.
Okay, so there will be a strategy which everyone can see. We can hold the success, or otherwise, let's hope success, of Brand Scotland 2. And we'll be able to use that and see it, and exporters will know what they can be working towards, and it's going to be there and transparent for everyone to see.
Well, I mean, the few things that fall from that are, one, any business you have in your constituency that think there is a market they can try and exploit, get them to get in touch, and then we can perhaps put them in touch with a mission in country, and there is some grant funding available between £3,000 and £20,000 they could access to help them to do that. And the second thing is, if we're not spending this money as we said we would spend it, the Treasury will certainly not be very keen to give us any more, I would imagine.
Okay, so how aligned is the strategy with the Scottish Government's 10-year plan?
Well, they're complementary, and they're not in conflict. They're supposed to complement each other, not compete. But this is the Scotland Office drive through our UK trade networks and our UK Foreign Office networks to try and improve exporting and to try and sell more Scottish products to the world and get more inward investment. So they're complementary to each other. And if you look at the three big trade deals that have been done so far in terms of the EU, US, and particularly India in the whisky context, because it's been the most stark, what we need to now do, from my perspective, as a Brand Scotland initiative, is to how do we now operationalise those great opportunities for whisky in country in India, and how can we support that, both as a Scotland office, both as an initiative like Brand Scotland, and indeed the FCDO and DBT on the ground in India. That's the key to unlocking the huge potential for the trade deal, not just for our big multinational companies, but for our whole supply chain all the way down the whisky sector.
Okay. And final question, and I just said, seeing the two strategies are complementary, are working together, how will you attribute success to one or the other? And again, coming back to not having a published strategy, how will we know if the success is down to Brand Scotland or not?
Well, in all honesty, I don't see it that way. If a business in your constituency ends up exporting more to India on the basis that we've done something or the Scottish Government's done something, don't really care who wants to take credit for that. I just need to want.
I don't think businesses will either, but it sort of all comes back round to, again, sort of spending public money well. Are we effectively putting the same money into two places for two different governments to do the same thing?
No, because our mission network is designed through the grant funding, in particular the £3,000 to £20,000, to help individual businesses and organisations to go to them directly to look for that grant funding. I don't think that kind of grant funding is available through the Scottish Government's processes.
Okay. And I assume you've sat down with the Scottish Government in rooms with them and discussed all this?
Well,
the two strategies
the
together?
Cabinet Secretary is not overly impressed with Brand Scotland, but we are working together to try and make it as fruitful as possible.
Good.
Sorry.
I would just add, obviously on an officials level, yes, there are lots of conversations with the officials working in the Scottish Government in this, and the Brand Scotland Fund has been mentioned that posts can bid into to create events or activities overseas are open to Scottish Government SDI colleagues as well, have access to that, and they obviously work very closely together at Post with FCDO colleagues and DBT colleagues, so it's very much joined up.
Yeah, if I could just add, Chair, I mean, obviously the reach of the UK Government's overseas network is just much wider. Yeah, so hopefully that will help with attribution, because we're just in many, many more places with expert advice. But the other place, you're right to push us on making sure there's alignment and so that we're spending the money well and there's no duplication. The other area that we could maybe come back to in a future committee is whether we're aligning well enough with Scottish cities as well. Because when I met with the Scottish Cities Alliance, a number of Scottish cities are very keen on international promotion, and we just need to make sure there's that's mutually reinforcing and not duplicative or wasteful in any way.
Yeah. And just to highlight that, the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce had recently been to Shanghai, and as the interim director in the Scotland office accompanied them to try and get some of their big projects over the line. So, measurables are what we're all looking for, but some of these things just need a nudge from government to get them over the line. Hopefully we'll get some very fruitful conclusions to that particular trip from the Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you all. Thank you.
I'm going to move on to a question about US trade tariffs. Thanks, MacDonald.
Thank you. Minister, I understand that Britain has got a trade surplus with the United States, and yet we've agreed a trade agreement where we are going to be paying 10% tariffs to the United States. So that hurts to start with. But could you explain what you think the implications are to Scotland from our trade agreement?
Well, look, the strategy of the government in terms of trade deals in particular, but in general, and the US in particular, is to make sure we're doing everything in the national interest. So we have the lowest tariffs than anywhere else in the world with the United States. It was really important to get that over the line. There was tens of thousands of jobs on the line almost instantly in terms of the car industry, for example. We've had to make a major legislative intervention at pace on British Steel, and that was under threat as a result. So we've managed to work at pace to get a deal with the US, the first deal across the line. And indeed, the Scotland office with Brand Scotland were in Washington on the day of which tariffs were introduced, and there was lots of discussions about trying to get that UK-US trade deal across the line as quickly as possible. So everything's been done in the national interest, and we're in a much better position today than we were before that trade deal was signed, and now it's a case of us trying to make sure that the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, and it's operationalised as quickly as possible. Alongside that, of course, you have to look upon this as the EU trade deal and the India trade deal as well. 3 massive trade deals, and I don't want to talk in slogans, but India is the fastest growing economy in the world. The US is the largest economy in the world. The EU is the largest trading economy in the world, and we've done complementary deals with them all. And we couldn't have done a deal with the EU had we not done this particular deal with the US in terms of restricting items that would be contravene the very high standards of EU food safety, for example. So the consequences for Scottish businesses should be incredibly positive.
Agriculture and Scotch whisky, for example, you don't think there'll be particularly negative impact on Scotland?
Well, I mean, the 10% on tariff on Scotch whisky obviously is a concern. It is low, but hopefully in terms of the direction of travel, you can see with our relationship with the US in trading terms is very positive. And I'm confident, having spoken to the industry, it's also worth saying that every single sector and every single business leader, including the Scotch Whisky Association and others, were very supportive of the government's approach in terms of that pragmatic, level-headed approach rather than perhaps doing our trade deals on a Friday evening on Twitter. And that's really important because we've got what's in the national interest now, and these are the start, not the end of the relationships, particularly with the EU. And if you look at the balancing of the India trade deal, which has been decades long in the making for the Scotch whisky industry, looking at them all as a whole, hopefully this is a very, very supportive package. And wherever you go, whichever distillery you're in, whichever whisky you're drinking, it'll have a hugely positive effect on those distillers.
Now going to move on to some questions about Grangemouth. Dave Duggan.
Thanks, Chair. The concern that many will have around Grangemouth and Project Willow is pace. I think that's not a controversial observation. The gap between the ending of refining operations and something coming to backfill that. What is your assessment of that threat, and what is your department and the UK government more generally doing, working with the Scottish government to try and accelerate that priority?
Well, I mean, in all honesty, I don't think it's a threat. I think it's a reality now because the refinery is closed. The vast majority of those jobs have gone. Apart from the decommissioning jobs and the jobs that have to be there for safety that will go. So that gap has always been the biggest concern. And in terms of whether it be Project Willow or the Falkirk Grangemouth City deal, in terms of that, it's got to be about pace as well and getting that online as quickly as possible. Pace is a problem because it's not just about regulation, it's not just about investment, but it's also about consenting and all of those issues coming together, and there's a whole plethora and matrix of overlapping reserved and devolved areas, which is why both governments have to work very closely together with Scottish Enterprise, of course, and indeed the local authorities involved. But the commitment to ring fencing a minimum of £200 million to the National Wealth Fund was to say to investors, you look at Grangemouth, bring investable propositions to the National Wealth Fund, we'll look at those at pace with this ring-fenced money. Now that's a minimum because if there's other projects that come along that require more that the National Wealth Fund can look at, it will obviously invest in those. The Scotland Office are taking a leading role in terms of chairing the ministerial committee at UK level to constantly update on where we are with Grangemouth, how we're pushing it forward through the GFIB, what opportunities are available, is there stuff outside Project Willow that's available. Companies are contacting us all the time, and I think there was 56 expressions of interest in terms of what to use the site for. So all the parties are working together, but yes, pace is the big issue, and we're trying to inject as much pace into that as possible. But some of these projects will take a little bit of time to get off the ground.
Can you give the committee an example of that which the Scotland office is doing to accelerate this?
Well, look, I can give you a number of examples. I was appointed to the Secretary of State role at 5 p.m. on Friday the 6th of July, and 8 a.m. on Saturday the 7th of July I was in the Scotland office being briefed on the issues at Grangemouth. Without putting too fine a point in it, both governments previous to that had failed to look at the seriousness of Grangemouth and the seriousness of the issue there. I think it had been 3 years in the making. So yes, while we're trying to work very much at pace, we're starting 3 or 4 years behind the tide, which is what NEOS have said to this committee, in fact, in terms of where we are with the timescales. So we're trying to inject that pace into there. The Prime Minister did 2 things, or 3 things actually. He commissioned the Scotland office to come up with a solution to the Grangemouth post refinery closure, which is where the £200 million came from, and the other package of measures around workers came from. We've been commissioned as a Scotland office to chair the cross-ministerial group, which we're pushing on at pace, and I write to the Prime Minister once a week to update him on what's happening with Grangemouth. So this is right at the top of the UK government's agenda, and we're working to be fair, very much hand in glove with the Deputy First Minister as well.
Yeah, and I think it's 25 million from Scottish Government, 200 from the National Wealth Fund. So I think, that's fine. Interesting though about that 200 million allocation from the National Wealth Fund, which is supposed to be operationally independent, yet the Prime Minister announced the £200 million allocation from the National Wealth Fund unilaterally. How does the government square that circle, that the National Wealth Fund is operationally independent until the Prime Minister wants to throw some of its money around?
Well, it's operationally independent in the sense that the projects that come forward to bid into that £200 million ring fence will still have to be investable propositions under the remit of the National Wealth Fund. But it was a commitment from the government to say, look, we're confident there's big investable propositions here. If there's investors out there who are circling Grangemouth or are interested in having a look or are Grangemouth curious, the government are backing this with National Wealth Fund money. There's obviously the Scottish Government money as well. There's £100 million in the Grangemouth and Falkirk growth deal, of which 20 million is allocated to the Grangemouth site. So yes, you're right, it's operationally independent, but the analysis of the funding will be operationally independent. The Prime Minister can't say, go and fund that particular project. And the 2 things that fall from that, Chair, if I may, the £25 million from the Scottish Government, that's be really good to see how that would be allocated as well. We've yet to get clarity on that as a ministerial group. And just slightly going back to the ACORN conversation, I think the First Minister at the Programme for Government committed £60 to £80 million plus. I think it was pretty much an open-ended for ACORN. Now that the commitment's been done for the £200 million development funding, it'd be interesting to see what the Scottish Government's spend profile is on that commitment to ACORN as well, because there's no, as going back to Mrs Cross' question about Brand Scotland, there's no point of us competing for funding. We should just bring all this together to show investors that there's a big pot of money out there if they wish to come and join the Grangemouth's bright future.
Of course, Scottish Government's going over and above energy being reserved to Westminster, not devolved to Holyrood. Just on a final point about INEOS and their behaviour today, are you confident we can rely, and the workers at Grangemouth can rely on INEOS as an honest broker when it comes to, something comes from Willow, hopefully multiple things will come from Willow, they'll require to create and stand up a facility on site at Grangemouth, where INEOS will very likely be the landlord. What exploratory work have we done? Have we got a memorandum of agreement? Have we got any kind of undertaking at all from INEOS that they are behind the ambitions of Project Willow and that they'll do their best to help facilitate it?
I mean, to be fair to INEOS, they did facilitate Project Willow. They worked very closely with the consultants to get the Project Willow together, because they had to drive it in terms of what the site's capability was and what the site currently has on its footprint. So I have never had anything other than what I would describe as good faith discussions with regards to Project Willow and INEOS, and the senior INEOS personnel at the plant have been at the plant for an awful long time. They care about the plant, they want it to have a very bright future. They live and work in the area too, they know the devastation on the community for the refinery closing. So they want Grangemouth to have a bright future. So at this moment in time, I don't have any concerns that any of us are operating in good faith, and indeed they've driven most of that Project Willow process forward. And just in terms of energy and devolved and reserved, regardless of where there's devolved and reserved responsibilities, whether it be in energy, economic development, planning, etc., the First Minister has indicated there's a pot of money there to be spent, and therefore let's make sure it's spent well.
We're now going to move on to some questions about the space sector in Scotland, and I'll hand to Susan Murray.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We're aware that Scotland is facing increasing international competition on space launch. To what extent is the UK at risk of losing its first mover advantage, and how can the UK government ensure we excel in leading on this opportunity?
Great question, actually, and I've been up to see the spaceport at Unst. I think the committee went last month to have a look as well. I mean, it's a pretty spectacular place, and we should be making sure we can exploit that to keep that first mover advantage. We've got the £20 million investment that's gone in to make sure that there's UK manufactured rockets and UK launch capability, and all of that in terms of the industrial strategy where it is mentioned, which was published on Monday. We want the UK to remain a world leader and a European leader in space launches. So you've seen it yourself, I've seen it too. I've been up to visit it and encourage everyone to go and visit the site itself and to see what they're doing up there. And it gives two opportunities. One is for us to exploit the great capability we've got up in Shetland, Unst and other places as well across Scotland. But it's also just a great opportunity for us to pull out all of our space puns and answers to questions. We know how vital UK government support is for Scotland's launch sector, but still public funding is lower in the UK compared to Europe. To what extent does the current level of UK government support match the scale of the opportunity that's presented? Well, I mean, I've mentioned the UK government commitment for £20 million for Orbex. There's the UK Space Agency offering another £5.5 million to the International Bilateral Fund. That's to support partnerships between the UK organisations and international space entities. The UK Space Agency Accelerator is open for them to use as well for early stage businesses to attract more investment into the spaceport, but also the supply chains around it. So there's a huge investment opportunity. It's mentioned in the industrial strategy as part of the advanced manufacturing sector, and that commits to prioritising frontier manufacturing industries with the greatest growth potential, including in space in Scotland. So it's specifically mentioned in the UK government's industrial strategy that's hot off the press. So I'm confident that we're supporting the space sector in Scotland and across the UK as much as we possibly can, and there's other funding opportunities there if they so wish to need and choose to use them.
So, as you said, we both visited the spaceport on Unst. The committee has visited, and it's clear that transport links are one of the biggest challenges for the growth of the site. So what can the UK government do to ensure that Scotland's transport infrastructure supports the potential growth for all industries in Scotland?
Well, look, infrastructure is a big issue. There's no doubt about that. Transport is devolved, although we have, as a UK government, been funding, I've lost the word, feasibility studies into transport connections. And it is, you've been on it yourself. There's 3 ferry connections. They have to all work and have to be there at the same time. I know using the F word in a committee where there's Scottish National Party members is not necessarily the best thing to do. But those those ferry connections are precarious. And of course, when Saxiford would have explained that the capability they have now means that the size of rockets and infrastructure they require is outgrowing the size of the ferry fleet to get them up to the spaceport. So there's lots of discussions going on about how that can be resolved. And I know that the councils up there in the islands have still got their proposal on the table to look at feasibility studies on tunnels. That is not on the agenda for the Scotland office at the moment, but we continue to discuss that with Shetland Council in particular.
The UK Government has accepted the Strategic Defence Review's recommendation that there should be a Cabinet subcommittee on space strategy. How would you think that this will help align cross-departmental efforts to support the success of launch in Scotland, and how much involvement, if any, will yourself, Secretary of State, and your department have?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about the space sector in the Scottish context a lot with Cabinet colleagues. There's obviously a plethora of different government departments that have an interest in this, including the Scottish Government as well. So we just all have to champion the space sector and what its capabilities are. I think there's probably, given it's in the industrial strategy under the advanced manufacturing section, a real opportunity now to look at the sectorial plans, the individual sectorial plans which have been published alongside the main industrial strategy, and trying to exploit those now. So our biggest challenge is that we've got some really, really brilliant opportunities in Scotland, whether it be ACORN, whether it be defence, whether it be space. And our job as a Scotland office is to make sure we can exploit those as much as we possibly can for the benefit of the Scottish economy and benefit of that jobs and growth. And that's what we do day in, day out, and what we'll continue to do, working hand in glove with our Scottish Government representatives, colleagues.
Will you be involved in the cross-departmental committee?
I'm not sure as yet. I don't know the answer to that question. Do we know?
I don't think there have been discussions yet on the level of that, but we can certainly look into it and come back to you.
If you want to make the case for us to be involved, we'd be very, very welcoming to see that in your report.
We tried to make the case to the Prime Minister for a Minister for Space, which I think would be very interesting, but I think he felt he probably had enough ministers to go around for the moment. But thank you for that. Our final question today is about the role of the Lord Advocate and comes from Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Chair. The Lord Advocate is a devolved law officer. The office has a dual role: the legal advisor to the Scottish Government and therefore a member of the Scottish Government, but also head of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. There is no similar dual role in England, Wales or Northern Ireland. Is there an actual or perceived conflict of interest there, and if so, should the role of Lord Advocate be reviewed?
I mean, this has been a discussion and debate that's been going on for some time, and I think when you talk to colleagues in England and Wales about this, they are astonished that those two roles are in one, with one person. That's no criticism of the Lord Advocate, whoever holds that role. But that dual role is difficult, and the Prime Minister's made that clear too, because the Prime Minister, having been the Director of Public Prosecutions, would have found it very difficult to operate as a dual role while sitting in Cabinet as well at the same time. So I do think that those roles should be split. It's a difficult process because there are devolved and reserved functions here. The Scotland Office have been looking at what the split of those responsibilities would be. The advice I have at the moment is it would probably require alteration to the Scotland Act, but the driver of the change of policy would have to come from the Scottish Parliament. So there is a bit of a mix of devolved and reserved functions as part of that. So it is Scottish Labour Party policy, as I understand it. It might be Scottish Liberal Democrat policy as well, and I think there are there's always been not concerns, questions raised within the Scottish Government themselves about whether or not the role should be split. So if there is a desire for the Scottish Government to do this, then we as a Scotland Office sit ready to support them in that.
So to split the role, you wouldn't necessarily regard it as a requirement of the UK Parliament to legislate. Do you see that really resting with the Scottish Parliament to instigate that?
Well, the instigation would have to come from the Scottish Parliament, yes, but there will be legislative implications for the Scotland Act, as I understand it, although until a proposal comes forward it can't be fully assessed in terms of what would be the requirements to split the roles. But I think it would be in the interest of the Lord Advocate more than anything else, because of the accusations of that conflict of interest, perceived or otherwise, to have that role split.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. That brings us to the end of our question session today. So I'd like to thank yourself, Minister McNeill and Ms McMillan, very much for the time you've given us today, and we look forward to seeing you on the next occasion you come before us. Thank you very much. Order.